If you ever get the chance to fly and visit Maine, I highly recommend it. Besides my experience, it's a beautiful state, full of lush green forest, amazing people, sights and sounds, and lighthouses aplenty. And while my wife and I were visiting the many lighthouses that Maine has to offer, I want to say we were somewhere right around the Crescent Beach State Park area, very close to, on the road 77, when my wife and I, at sundown, saw something to us that resembled a pterodactyl off in the distance, east into the ocean. We were driving northbound, and my wife, on the passenger side, looked over to her right, tapped my shoulder, and said, "Honey, look at that. What kind of bird is that?" I slowed the car down and looked to see what she was looking at, and we both saw it, clear as day, even in the sunset. There's no mistaking the silhouette of a flying dinosaur, especially in modern day in our pop culture. And if you've ever been familiar with the movie Jurassic Park, you would be able to spot that out quite well, as we did. It looked exactly like a silhouette of the pterodactyl from those movies, except it had a long tail that flew behind it, with what looked to be a little triangle shape at the end of it. But it had that exact same pterodactyl head, and a long fin-like bill sitting on the top of its head that arched slowly backwards. It was flying southeast of us, and I can't really guess distances, but far enough away where we could clearly see the silhouette of this thing. And anybody on the road at that time had a clear view of this thing too. I never thought dinosaurs were real. I can't think of any other way to conclude what we saw. There is real-life dinosaurs living around Maine. My great-grandfather used to do a ton of fishing back when he was much younger, in his better years, as he always tells me. He was probably in his later 20s, and later on retired in his later 30s, due to an accident that left him paralyzed from the legs down. And while most of his fishing stories are harmless, entertaining, and joyful, he has one that he's told me a couple of times about his encounter with what he calls the MERFOK. These aren't some fairy tale Disney mermaid people. No. These are some sort of sea creature humanoids, he describes them. Black eyes, ugly blue aqua skin, almost frail and skeletal looking, and nearly attempted to pull his fellow sailor overboard and drown him had he not gone in time to rescue him. Forgive me, because I can't recount every detail he told me about the story, but it goes something like this. That they were pouring chum in the water. They were attracting sharks for, I don't exactly remember, but I do know there was a reason. Well, sharks did indeed show up, just like they had wanted. But after the sharks cleared out, and they were getting ready to pack everything up and pull all the lines in, or whatever it is that fishermen do, these things came in and up to the boat. Merfolk is what my great-grandfather calls them. They popped their heads out of the water, reached up, and tried to pull my great-grandfather's fellow sailor out over the boat by reaching up and grabbing onto him as he's pulling up the net or the line. He told me these things possess great fangs, lots of razor-sharp teeth, and are completely hideous and very large, easily 10 to 13 feet in length total. The very first time I heard this story, I did my best to scour the entire internet for any sort of reference artwork or photos that I could use to show my grandfather to see if he can pinpoint in the right direction. Well, I tried looking at merfolk, I tried looking at mermaids, and nothing quite rang a bell. I had shown my great-grandfather various artwork from DeviantArt, from people who had drawn fantasy merfolk, and he said some of them were on the mark, while others were far off, but somewhere in the ballpark. Then, I also showed him pictures of the Naga from the Warcraft series in World of Warcraft. He said the female Naga creatures of whatever world that is, whatever fantasy game that is, got pretty close, but still, not exactly quite. He said they were more dead-looking and more humanoid, so much that it was frightening by their appearance alone. So I continued to show him more artwork, but I don't feel like it got us anywhere. But overall, I feel like I have a decent idea of what these things look like. If you want to look yourself, just go on Google and look at some of the DeviantArt artwork from some of these merfolk creatures that some of these fantasy artists draw. I guess my great-grandfather grabbed this long harpoon spear-like weapon and jabbed it at these several merfolk, as he says. They fled, while hissing, but fleeing from the boat. He thinks he didn't scare them away, but merely bought them enough time to get out of there as quick as they could. When back to shore, his friend, who was initially grabbed by one of these things, had this purple-green ooze coming out of his wound where it grabbed him and tore open his skin. This same friend ended up going to the hospital, but since it was shortly after World War II, in the late 1940s, there wasn't a lot medically they could do. But it caused severe burning, and he had severe allergic reactions, causing his skin to almost welt up and shrivel in certain spots. All around the wound, parts of the flesh, right where the wound were, died, which doctors believed at the time he had a mild form of necrosis somehow, if I'm naming the right medical condition, where parts of your flesh die. The same thing happens if you get bit by a brown recluse spider. It was like that, but much more severe. That encounter never stopped my great-grandfather from doing what he loved, which was fishing. But his friend, who was attacked, never went back out on the sea again after that, and just stayed fishing from shore. My sister moved out far to rural Maine about 8 or 9 years ago, right outside of a very small town called Robbinston. I had never been there before, so I decided, since I was exploring the East Coast at the time via a road trip, to go and pay her a visit. While Maine and all the area surrounding her home was beautiful, full of surreal landscapes and scenes you can only imagine out of a cinematic picture, it was an amazing experience. But the creature that my sister and I saw that night while at our house was a completely different story. My sister, already living outside a very rural town to begin with, lives pretty much out in the middle of nowhere, or she likes to call it the sticks. Surrounding her house isn't really a lush forest, like you would expect it to be. More so thickly green pastures, filled with lots of tree coverage, and even a very small lake not too far from her house. It's actually walking distance, but it's not a private lake at all. On one of the nights I was there with her, we were staying up, watching movies, and just hanging out, talking, reminiscing on the good old days of Mom and Dad's crazy stories, when we started hearing noise outside. We ran to the window out of curiosity, because what we were hearing didn't coincide with any noise that we should be hearing this far out. I mean, there might be animals, but for animals to make this much banging and clanging didn't make much sense at all. We were looking, and because it's so dark, with only the moon and stars to give us any sort of visual aid, it didn't allow us much, but we could see a dark, tall shape moving around, not too far from her house, over by her old woodshed, or where she keeps all of her gardening supplies. What my sister and I saw terrified us. From my perspective, it looked like a tall Doberman pinscher standing on 2 legs, very finely pointed ears, a very long and very pronounced, distinctive and chiseled snout, rippling muscles, and huge hands attached to very long arms. Even with the light outside, or the lack of light, I can make out these things. And I think my sister could too, because she started gasping, hyperventilating, and freaking out. I think I saw it first, because I asked her, what is that? And she saw it too. Then we both, in unison, began freaking out. I told her, who do we call? What do we do if this thing comes up to the house? Do you have any guns? Is there any way to protect yourself? I told her maybe we should call the cops or animal control, but she refused. I looked back out the window, and now, it was even more horrifying. Whatever this thing was now facing our direction, as if it knew we were talking about it, looking right back at us through the darkness. And the only thing we could see, besides its shape and silhouette, were these faintly glowing red dots on its head, which I knew instinctively were its eyes. I almost dropped to the floor in fear, and my sister was already running, grabbing a knife from the kitchen, locking every window and door, and closing the curtains. I remember somewhere in the conversation, I asked her, "Sis, why didn't you tell me you guys had werewolves out here?" And she promised me she didn't know. She had no idea. Or did she have any idea what kind of creature or animal this was, that she had never seen it before? We could still hear it banging around out by her old woodshed. Then it went quiet for a few minutes. That's when we could hear it slowly approach the house. We could hear heavy, bipedal footsteps, thud, 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 on the ground. Like each step, a person who weighed 400 or 500 pounds. It was very slow, as if this thing wanted us to hear it coming. We weren't really sure what to do. My sister had a very large knife, and she did not have a gun on her, which surprised me. But then the footsteps stopped altogether, and so we sat there, with everything locked up, curtains closed, and all the lights off, for probably about 20 minutes. We didn't hear anything, not even the crickets outside, and this was late June. The outside life should be alive, and nothing. It was quiet. I brought up the bright idea. Hey, maybe we should make a run for it, run out to my car, and go to a hotel for the night, just to be safe. I'm surprised to say that she agreed, and we counted to 3, opened the front door, and both ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, got in, turned on my car, shined the brights. Thankfully, this thing wasn't doing your typical Hollywood cliche of standing right in the way of your car. And so, my sister and I drove to the nearest hotel or motel, which was a little ways away. We ended up staying there for the night, each getting separate rooms. The night went fine, I guess as fine as it can go after something like that. When we returned in the AM, we didn't see any signs of a break-in or anything that would prove that somebody was out there last night, or something. The shed where she keeps her tools was not damaged in any way, nor could we really pinpoint where that banging was coming from, or what it was doing, and why it was making that noise. We couldn't see any footprints or any damage to the house. We probably sat there for a good hour and tried to rationalize what we saw, although can you even truly rationalize a sighting like that?